Hello, how are you? I'm Lilei. The book we're discussing today is one you've surely heard of, Don Quixote. It's such a fun book. Even if you haven't read the original, just hearing the name Don Quixote, you'll surely picture him in your mind. An wizened old man with a little beard, riding a skinny horse dressed in armor, holding a lance, charging at a huge spinning windmill. I will fight with the windmills, right? It's so amusing. This iconic image has undoubtedly made its mark in literary history. Don Quixote was born over 400 years ago, translated into over 100 languages, and stands as the most prestigious and influential work in Spanish literary history. Legend has it that King Philip III of Spain once saw a young man standing on a balcony of the palace, laughing uncontrollably while reading a book. The king remarked, "He must be reading Don Quixote, or else he is mad." Sure enough, the young man was reading Don Quixote. Today, when we read this novel, we too find ourselves laughing heartily. The story of Don Quixote is quite simple and can be summed up in a few sentences. An aging country gentleman, obsessed with chivalric romances, decides to become a knight-errant. With a burst of enthusiasm, he takes along a naive fellow townsman as his squire, imitates medieval knights, and embarks on adventures, and then gets himself into a series of ludicrous situations. But here's a question. If Don Quixote is merely a comic figure, how has this work endured for over 4 centuries and remained a classic? It wasn't until recent years that I understood the poet Byron's assessment of this book. He said, "Don Quixote is the saddest of all stories." Why? Because Don Quixote is a single-minded fool, relentlessly pursuing justice and the unwavering spirit of a knight. Thus, he is out of touch with reality, lacks flexibility, and is not scheming. His virtues, however, make him appear foolish and mad in the eyes of others, leading to his pitiful fate. Have you noticed how this world has an overabundance of clever people to the extent that we now find ourselves short of fools? As I came to understand Byron's viewpoint and reread this book honestly, I found myself laughing a little less joyfully. But there's something good about it. I now appreciate the value of being a fool, and I do mean that with quotation marks. Today, let's discuss this book and start with its author, Cervantes. He was a Spaniard, and his full name was Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Whatever his name is, you should know he's a world-renowned literary master. It's quite unfortunate, though, that during his lifetime, Cervantes was just a disabled soldier and a destitute writer who did not achieve high acclaim. He was born in 1547, and there's very little record about his early life. We only know that in 1569 he left Spain for Rome and, in the following year, joined the Spanish army stationed in Italy as an ordinary soldier. In 1571 he participated in the famous Battle of Lepanto, suffering wounds in 3 places, leaving his left hand permanently disabled, showing how much he desired to be a hero. In 1575, Cervantes was captured by pirates and spent 5 years as a slave in Algiers. This experience later became part of the first part of Don Quixote. During his captivity, Cervantes attempted 4 escapes with his fellow prisoners, all of which failed. Yet, he was remarkably brave and honorable. After each failure, he stood up to take full responsibility, refusing to betray his comrades, even at the risk of death. This courage and integrity impressed even the brutal pirates, sparing his life out of respect for his bravery. In 1580, Cervantes was finally ransomed and returned to his homeland, Spain. He was penniless and handicapped, unable to do much. In 1587, he secured a job of procuring supplies for the Spanish Armada, but was falsely accused of mishandling accounts and subsequently imprisoned. In 1594, Cervantes took up a post as a tax collector, but was accused of embezzlement and imprisoned once again. Hence, there's a saying that the first part of Don Quixote was penned by Cervantes while he was in jail. Cervantes' life was indeed quite dramatic. By this point, he had already lived over half his life. When was Don Quixote published? It was in 1605, when Cervantes was 58 years old, nearing 60. The work became an immediate success upon publication. Unfortunately, this did not improve Cervantes's financial situation, and he remained a poor man until his death. In 1615, the Archbishop of Spain visited the French ambassador. The ambassador's aide inquired about Cervantes, wondering how he was doing. The response was that Cervantes was old, a former soldier and minor country gentleman, and very poor. The aide was surprised and asked why Spain did not support the famous man financially. A clergyman responded that if Cervantes had written out of poverty, they hoped God would never let him become wealthy, as his poverty enriched everyone. This irony is hard to accept. It seems a writer must be poor. Regardless, the first part of Don Quixote was so successful that everyone knew Cervantes's name. Fake versions appeared, including bad sequels by others imitating Cervantes' style. Cervantes saw these and was furious. He quickly started writing the second part himself. The second part of Don Quixote was published in 1615. In this part, Cervantes mercilessly mocked and criticized those who imitated him. To prevent it from happening again, he killed Don Quixote in the end. He wrote the ending that Don Quixote died of illness at home, putting a termination to the character's life. After completing this work in the following year, 1616, Cervantes suffered severe edema and passed away on April 23rd, which happens to be World Book Day. His funeral was a quiet affair. He was hastily buried in a monastery cemetery in Madrid. It's said that besides his wife, hardly anyone attended his burial. Over 200 years later, Madrid erected a monument in his honor. It stands in a square in Madrid with statues of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. This has become a famous Spanish landmark. As time passes, classics gain more recognition. A touching Spanish saying goes, "Even when everything seems lost, we still have Don Quixote." The German poet Heinrich Heine said he reread Don Quixote every 5 years. Each time he had a different impression of the novel. Like The Little Prince we discussed earlier, it remains ever fresh. At different ages, you'll have different feelings and understandings of it. That's the relationship between a classic and a person. It brings growth and changes in mindset. Let's return to Don Quixote, who is initially seen in Spain as a genuine madman, quite ridiculous. In literary circles, it was considered a comic story and a popular read. Spanish critics even said Cervantes was ignorant. Though talented, he only entertained. The label of ignorant and incompetent stuck with Cervantes for nearly 300 years. Therefore, for a long time, Don Quixote was underestimated. When did people realize its greatness? It started in England. There, Don Quixote was much better received, with writers and critics paying it considerable attention. One English novelist, Fielding, said most people are mad, differing from Don Quixote only in their type of madness. Based on Don Quixote, he wrote his own play, Don Quixote in England. In this play, Don Quixote tells Sancho Panza, "Let them call me mad. I'm not mad enough to win their approval." Yes, he's an innocent man unaffected by others' opinions. In their eyes, Don Quixote isn't just a target of ridicule, he becomes a critic of human nature and society. Many characters like Don Quixote appear in British literature. There's Adam Priest in Fielding's work, Toby Uncle in Sterne's work, and Dickens's Mr. Pickwick. They're all like Don Quixote, comical, sympathetic, and deserving of respect. Today we'll talk about this book. I've chosen Yang Jiang's translation. Some place and person names of it differ slightly due to the era, which doesn't matter much. Let's first talk about who Don Quixote is. The book describes a gentleman named Alonso Quijano, nearly 50 years old, living in a village in La Mancha, Spain. He has a housekeeper in her 40s and a niece not yet 20. They aren't wealthy like nobles, but live comfortably. This gentleman, idle and at leisure, has only one hobby: reading chivalric romances. Over time, he becomes so obsessed that he loses his reason. His head is filled with magic, duels, battles, love, and suffering from the books. He believes only such a life is worth living. And all these stories are true. He deeply believes he can imitate the great knights in novels. So this gentleman takes them as role models and decides to become a knight-errant. The world is vast, and he must go to see it in person. He yearns for adventure, to fight injustice, and serve his country. He decides to take action, not just be lost in novels. His first step is to clean a set of armor that's been passed down in his family for years, left neglected in a corner, rusty and musty. He tries every way to polish it until it gleams, but he discovers a problem. The armor is incomplete. It lacks a visor to protect his entire face, only a skull cap without a vizard. What should he do? This gentleman ingeniously fills the gap. He manages to make a mask out of hard paper and attaches it to the skull cap, completing the helmet. When it's done, he needs to test it. Is it strong enough? Will it withstand a sword blow? So he takes a sword himself and strikes down, ruining his work of this week. This disappoints him greatly. Then he uses several iron sheets to reinforce it and makes a new face guard. He thinks it's strong enough in his mind, even if he doesn't dare strike it with the sword. As a knight-errant, he must have a horse. This gentleman has a skinny horse, a rather bad, lame horse, but he sees it as a once-in-a-lifetime horse, so he must give it a great name. It takes him 4 days to name his horse, which is awkwardly called Rocinante, meaning rare and uncommon. Now that his horse has a good name, he himself needs a good name. This gentleman thinks for 8 days and calls himself Don Quixote. Yes, that's where the name comes from. According to tradition, to show the origin of a hero has to add the place name of his hometown after his name. So our knight-errant's full name is Don Quixote de la Mancha, according to the tradition of that year. After doing all this, it's not over yet. One thing is crucial and is one of the core of the whole book. Let's see how Cervantes wrote, saying, his armor was already cleaned up, the skull cap had been changed to a helmet, the horse had a name, and he had a name. But he felt it wasn't enough. Why? A knight should have a sweetheart. If a wandering knight doesn't have a lover, it's like a tree without leaves and fruit, and a shell without a soul. So Don Quixote thought that knights often encounter giants. If I fight a giant or a dragon and cut it in half, I can make it my servant and command it to visit my lovely lady. I'll make it kneel before her, humbly saying, Madam, I am the giant so-and-so, king of such-and-such island. The great knight Don Quixote defeated me in a duel and sent me to your service. Don Quixote envisioned this so vividly, naive yet charming. He believed his reputation should shine in the eyes of his beloved. But in reality, he's just an old man nearing 50. Where would he find a sweetheart? So he thought of a village woman nearby named Aldonza. Don Quixote decided to give his beloved a fancier name, Dulcinea del Toboso, quite a mouthful. Ironically, this woman, now named Dulcinea by Don Quixote, had no idea she'd become someone's love interest. She didn't even know him. Nevertheless, Don Quixote thought, no problem, everything's ready. So, one scorching July morning, without telling anyone, our knight quietly left through the back door and embarked on his adventure. But just as he reached the outskirts, he realized a crucial oversight that almost ruined his venture. What was it? He suddenly remembered he hadn't been knighted yet. According to knightly rules, he couldn't duel with anyone without that title. This troubled him deeply. What to do? Don Quixote decided. If he meets someone on the road, he will ask them to knight him. And sure enough, opportunity knocked. After a day's journey, exhausted and famished, he arrived at an inn. To Don Quixote's eyes, everything resembled the knightly tales. The inn was like a castle, the weary woman at the door, a noble lady, and the innkeeper, a castle master. He was fully in character now, imagining many scenes. But to the inn staff, Don Quixote looked absurd, dressed oddly and talking wildly. They just laughed aloud and no one took him seriously. Did this affect Don Quixote? Not at all. He was lost in his fantasies, determined to become a true knight soon. So he told the innkeeper, "Tomorrow you'll knight me." Don Quixote strictly followed the rule. A knight-elect must spend the night awake, guarding his armor and praying, and that's exactly what he did. Next to the inn was a courtyard where he kept his armor. Piece by piece he laid it out near the well, shield on his arm, spear in hand, strutting proudly around the armor. As darkness fell and the spectators dispersed, Don Quixote remained steadfast, eyes fixed on his armor. It was a sacred moment for him. Just then, a mule skinner from the inn wanted to fetch water from the well to feed his group of mules. He moved Don Quixote's armor piled by the trough. The knight rushed over, shouting, "Hey, careless fellow! This armor belongs to the bravest knight with a sword. You want to touch his armor? Whoever you are, watch out and don't mess around, or prepare to pay with your life." He felt the dignity of a knight, but the unlucky mule skinner ignored him, thinking he was just a madman, then grabbed the armor and tossed it far away. What could the knight do? A knight had to act according to tradition. Don Quixote looked up as if speaking to his beloved Dulcinea, then said, "My lady, my heart devoted to you is insulted for the first time. I beg you for rescue. This is my first urgent moment. Please don't hesitate to bless me." After his prayer, he raised his lance and struck the mule skinner's head, causing serious injury. Other mule skinners saw their companion hurt and started picking up stones, hurling them at Don Quixote. He immediately felt like he was a true challenged knight, which only boosted his courage. Even if all the mule skinners in the world came at him, he was determined not to retreat. But his main duty was to guard the armor. Unable to rush into the fight, he raised his shield to block the stones and beat and shouted amidst the chaos. The innkeeper heard the commotion and rushed over, persuading everyone to disperse. He said, "Look, this man is clearly mad. Why bother with him?" To calm Don Quixote's frenzy, the innkeeper decided to knight him right away and send him on his way quickly. How did the ceremony go? The innkeeper handed Don Quixote a ledger, called over a young boy with a candle, and brought 2 girls from the inn. He instructed Don Quixote to kneel down. The innkeeper read from the ledger with solemn words. Then he raised his hand and slapped Don Quixote on the neck, then with his sword gave a hard pat on his shoulder. One of the girls stepped forward to hang the sword, wishing the knight success in all his battles. Don Quixote was deeply moved. He felt the ceremony completed his transformation. He asked the girl about her name, saying he would one day serve her. The girl didn't want to talk to him at all. The absurd ceremony ended hastily, but Don Quixote thought he was already a knight now. Delighted, he didn't wait for dawn, eagerly riding off on his adventure, believing he had a great future ahead. The innkeeper was relieved that the man finally left without even paying for his stay. Despite this disability, he enthusiastically participated in the following year's Battle of Navarino. Unfortunately, our knight didn't get far on his adventure this time before disaster struck. Let's go into more detail. The next day, Don Quixote arrived at a crossroad and immediately thought of the novels where knights-errant chose their paths. Following the book's example, he loosened the reins and let his horse decide for itself. How did the horse feel about this? Not far from its home, the skinny horse remembered exactly where its stable was, so it made up its mind to gallop towards the village. After a few kilometers, he suddenly saw a group of merchants approaching. Don Quixote believed he was encountering a marvelous adventure. Just like in the book, he sat up proudly in the saddle, gripping his lance firmly and shielding his chest with his shield. He stood in the middle of the road, held back his horse, and awaited the approaching group. When they got close enough to exchange greetings, Don Quixote raised his voice proudly and said, "All of you must acknowledge the peerless beauty in the world. None can bear comparison with the lady of my heart in La Mancha, the unique Dulcinea del Toboso." Who was that? Exactly that village maiden. But Don Quixote had already renamed her in his mind, considering her his ideal lady. So he declared to everyone that she was of utmost importance, warning them not to pass without acknowledging her. The merchants, seeing this strange figure and hearing his words, thought he was mad. They decided to tease him, and one of them said, "We don't know who this beauty you speak of is. If you want us to acknowledge her, then show her to us." Don Quixote replied, "Why should you need to see her to acknowledge her? The key is to believe without seeing, and to wholeheartedly accept it as truth. If you refuse, then come and face me in combat. Let's settle this." The merchant continued to jest. "Show us a picture, then. We've been longing for this lady you speak of. Even if one of her eyes is blind and the other bleeds vermilion and sulphur, we'll still praise her to please you." Upon hearing this, Don Quixote was furious. He knew they were mocking him. Grabbing his lance, he charged towards the merchant. But unfortunately, his horse stumbled and threw him into the field, rolling him quite a distance away. Poor Don Quixote, weighed down by his equipment, lance, shield, armor, he couldn't even get up after the fall. To make matters worse, a grumpy lad from the merchant group approached him and snapped his lance in two with a click, then proceeded to give Don Quixote a good beating. Our unlucky knight, beaten sore all over, couldn't get back up. What should he do? In such a dire situation, Don Quixote pondered and said to himself, "Even knights in the books don't win every battle. They're bound to get injured sometimes." Reciting a passage, he lamented, "Where are you, my lady? How can you show no pity for my pain? Perhaps, my lady, you are unaware of my pain, or worse, you have forsaken me." Don Quixote had another wild idea. Just then, a fellow villager happened to pass by. Recognizing Don Quixote in such a sorry state, he helped him onto his donkey, tied Don Quixote's weapons and shield together, and made Don Quixote's skinny horse carry them. Leading the donkey with one hand and the horse with the other, they headed back towards the village. The villager was thoughtful enough to wait until nightfall before entering the village, sparing Don Quixote the embarrassment of being seen in such a sorry state. And so our gallant knight-errant concluded his first adventure. But did he give up? Not at all. Next up was the famous windmill battle, where Don Quixote was about to face his next challenge. Initially, Cervantes had planned just a short story, but after finishing Don Quixote's first adventure, he felt he hadn't had his fill and continued writing, expanding the tale with more characters entering the story. Who entered next? First, Don Quixote's friends, the village priest and a barber. When Don Quixote was brought home, his housekeeper was complaining to them, "My master has been missing for 3 days. He must have gone out pretending to be a knight, all because of those nonsensical books." Just then, they saw the villager returning with a disheveled Don Quixote. Though barely able to dismount, Don Quixote sat upright on his donkey, saying, "Don't listen to them. It's all that horse's fault for getting me hurt. Get me to bed and find a way to summon the lady healer, Urganda, to tend to my wounds." The housekeeper grumbled, "No need for any Urganda. We'll take care of you." Then he cursed the night novels again. "These books have ruined your mind." Together, they helped Don Quixote onto his bed. As they burned the books, they also critiqued them, pointing out Cervantes' own criticisms of the popular novels at the time through the characters' dialogue, poking fun at their flaws. This was Cervantes' initial intention when writing Don Quixote. Yet, Cervantes had personal biases. He praised some novels written by his friends or individuals he admired, even going so far as to lavish praise on their prose and poetry collections in his book. After burning the books, His friends were hoping that Don Quixote would recover and stop acting crazy. When Don Quixote woke up, he found the books gone, and he was unable to enter his study. His niece came to tell him, "A magician has arrived and made all those books in your study disappear." After hearing this, Don Quixote believed the magician to be a character from the night novels, and he firmly believed the magician had been sent by another knight to oppose him. He immediately declared, "Let's see what fate has in store. No one can defy destiny." He believed himself to be an extraordinary knight, since someone has sent a magician to oppose him. For the next 15 days, Don Quixote seemed quite obedient and didn't cause any more trouble. But in reality, he secretly persuaded a local farmer, who was also a famous character in the book, Sancho Panza. Sancho was a short, chubby man with a comical appearance. Don Quixote found Sancho and convinced him with promises, saying he would become a king in the future and reward Sancho with an island to govern. So now, Sancho was following Don Quixote, leaving behind his wife and children, quietly leaving the village for their second adventure. This time, Don Quixote even had a squire. He seemed quite impressive. Their first encounter was the famous windmill battle. Here's how the story goes. Don Quixote saw 30 to 40 windmills in the countryside and said to Sancho, "Can you see those giants? I will go and destroy them to make contributions to God." Sancho said, "Where are the giants? Those are windmills." Don Quixote immediately scolded Sancho, saying, "You are so ignorant. You're as stupid as a wooden block." He told him to stay aside, and rode his skinny horse to rush forward. At this moment, a slight wind started to blow, and the windmills began to turn. Don Quixote saw them and said, "Even if you wave your arms more than a great giant, I will still fight with you." He completely imagined a hallucination that didn't exist in reality. After saying all this, he devoutly prayed to his lady Dulcinea, asking her to protect him in this critical moment. Then he shielded himself with his shield, dragged his long spear, and urged his horse forward, charging towards the first windmill. He aimed to kill the giant windmill, but his spear struck its wings, which were spinning vigorously in the wind. The force pulled his spear in, tossing both him and his horse aside. He rolled on the ground, utterly battered. Seeing this, Sancho quickly rode over on a donkey to rescue him. Getting close, Sancho found Don Quixote unable to move, having been thrown hard by his own horse. This was Don Quixote's battle with the windmills, only 2 pages in total, yet it became one of the most famous scenes in literary history. There have been many interpretations by later readers of Don Quixote's battle with the windmills. Some say it symbolizes heroism in the face of inevitable failure, where the giant windmill represents all the obstacles and even malice we encounter in life, whether external or internal obsessions, curses, or illusions. Don Quixote, battling against the windmills, almost inevitably ends in defeat. But even so, he charges ahead. As Nietzsche said, life ultimately is tragic, yet even in tragedy, we should embrace our lives filled with pain and despair. So, sometimes reading is really about interpretation. You'll see what is in your heart. Throughout the novel, Don Quixote is indeed madly eccentric, yet simultaneously brave, with a poignant sense of heroism. He continually fights, engages in battles, but only wins twice. But even so, this doesn't destroy his passion and determination. Let's talk about his first victory. Don Quixote said, "Sancho Panza, my brother, this place is teeming with dangers and knights aplenty. But remember, even if you see me in grave danger, you must not draw your sword to protect me. If my opponent is a commoner, you can help. But if it's a knight, according to the rules of chivalry, you must not intervene. You'll need to be knighted yourself if you want to fight alongside me." He was quite rigid about it. Sancho replied, "Sir, I hear you loud and clear. Absolutely no mistake. I am by nature a peaceful man, not one for quarrels. Of course, if I need to protect myself, I won't be worrying about those rules. Whether they're divine or human, one must be allowed to defend oneself, right?" Just as they were talking, a carriage approached. Inside was a noble lady with several attendants, and accompanying them were 2 monks. Don Quixote, all fired up, said to Sancho, "If I'm not mistaken, we've stumbled upon an extraordinary adventure. Those dark figures up ahead must be sorcerers. There's no doubt sorcerers. They've kidnapped a princess in this carriage, and I must do my utmost to right this wrong." Don Quixote was caught up in his sense of justice, imagining many dramatic scenarios. However, Sancho recognized the monk's attire, and guessed the others were just travelers passing through. He advised Don Quixote not to charge ahead, but Don Quixote wouldn't listen. He spurred his horse and charged forward, scaring one of the monks so much that he fell off his mule. Sancho rushed forward and started stripping the monk's clothes off. The monk's mule driver asked, "Why are you stripping his clothes?" Sancho replied, "My master has won a battle, so I'm here to claim the spoils." "I have a share in this too." The 2 mule drivers were furious at his nonsense. They rushed up, knocked Sancho down, and beat him, pulling out every hair from his beard and kicking him until he passed out. Meanwhile, what was Don Quixote doing? At this moment he was talking to the lady in the carriage, spouting the usual stuff, saying, "I am a daring knight-errant named Don Quixote. The beauty I adore is none other than the incomparable Lady Dulcinea, and now that I've routed your robbers, you don't need to reward me. Just go to Toboso and tell Lady Dulcinea about how I saved you," and so on and so forth. After he finished his speech, everyone was confused, completely unsure of what this man was here for. Among the lady's attendants was a foreign Biscayan, who spoke in Biscayan, somewhat incomprehensibly to Don Quixote, saying, "Go, unlucky knight! I swear to God who created me, if you don't let the carriage pass, I'll kill you for real." Don Quixote understood what he said and calmly replied, "You're no knight. If you were, with your confused behavior, I would have punished you long ago. But since you're not a knight, I can't fight you." The Biscayan and Don Quixote were trading insults, escalating their anger. Don Quixote drew his sword and lunged at the Biscayan. The man was riding a hired mule, a cantankerous beast with a bad temper. Seeing Don Quixote charging towards him, he didn't even bother to change a mount. In the heat of the moment, he grabbed a cushion from a nearby carriage and used it as a shield. Don Quixote spurred his horse and charged forward, while the Biscayan also tried to charge back. Unfortunately, the mule he was riding wasn't cut out for this sort of thing. It had already traveled a long way and was utterly exhausted. The mule refused to budge an inch, standing there motionless, watching Don Quixote charge towards him. Both men raised their swords high, aiming to cleave each other in two. The Biscayan struck first with a powerful blow, driven by rage, but his aim was off. The sword slashed across Don Quixote's left shoulder, cutting through half of his armor, along with a chunk of his helmet and half an ear. Had fate not intervened, this might have been the end of our valiant knight's adventurous life. Enraged beyond measure, Don Quixote sat upright in his saddle again, raised both hands high, and brought his sword down towards the Biscayan's head. The man, using the shield, actually a cushion, from the nearby carriage to defend himself, but it was futile. Poor Biscayan's head collapsed under the impact, blood gushing from his nose, mouth, and ears, as he fell heavily to the ground. This is one of the rare victories of the valiant Don Quixote, which sounds quite comical. But regardless, Don Quixote thought to himself that he had won after all, enough to boast about for a year or more. From then on, Don Quixote continued his wild escapades. One moment he was charging at flocks of sheep, the next he was releasing prisoners from their captors. Unfortunately, luck wasn't always on his side. 9 times out of 10, he deserved the misfortunes that befell him. Sometimes he accidentally killed someone's sheep and got several teeth knocked out by the angry shepherd. And sometimes he freed the prisoners, only to get a beating from them and have his clothes robbed. Sancho Panza suffered along with him. Eventually, Sancho didn't want to be his squire anymore. He had hoped to become a governor of an island by following Don Quixote, but now he was often getting beaten up, rolled in blankets and tossed up and down for fun, and even had his beloved donkey stolen. When people curiously asked, "What are you two up to?" they would reply, "We're adventurous knights." "What's that?" they'd ask. Sancho would answer on behalf of his master, "You really don't know? Let me tell you. An adventurous knight is someone who gets beaten one day and is made a king the next. Today they're the unluckiest and poorest in the world. Tomorrow they're handing out 2 or 3 crowns to their attendants." This sounds like complaining and teasing, but Don Quixote didn't catch on at all. Not only did he not catch on, but he was delighted by it, believing it to be true because that's how it was written in the book. Sancho also introduced his master to others, saying, "This brave soul is the famous Don Quixote de la Mancha, a knight with a mournful face." Don Quixote asked him, "Why do you say that?" Sancho replied, "Because you fight until you're exhausted, lose teeth, and look all bedraggled like you're mourning." Don Quixote didn't get mad when he heard this. He was actually really happy. See, in those knight novels, all the knights have nicknames like Rocket Knight or Phoenix Knight. So the mournful knight seemed like a good nickname to him. He figured that if someone ever writes a great biography about him someday, maybe they'll just pick that name out of thin air, sort of a psychic connection, you know. So, right then and there, he told Sancho about it. It's not like Sancho made it up or anything. It was destiny. So our naive knight-errant decided to embrace the nickname, and like all knights do, he painted that mournful face right onto his shield. And from then on, that's how his shield looked, just a big old mournful face. You hear this and think, what a bunch of nonsense. Yes, that's what Cervantes did to mock the popular knight novels of his time, satirizing those unrealistic and overly serious, absurd stories. What other ridiculous antics did Don Quixote get up to? There's an interesting part where he writes that Don Quixote and Sancho came to a mountain and suddenly had the urge to imitate the great knights Amadis and Roldan by going mad for their lady loves. Yes, that's how the book puts it. Those knights, because they were scorned by their loves, retreated to the mountains to do penance. Then there were some knights who uprooted trees, committed murder and arson, and dragged away mares backwards, all because of love wounds. Don Quixote decided he wanted to emulate them, but Sancho quickly intervened, saying, "I reckon knights who do such things must have a reason, usually some kind of trigger that makes them go bonkers and suffer through hardships. What's your reason for going mad? Has some lady looked down on you? Or have you spotted something suspicious about Miss Dulcinea and think she has done something unruly with someone else?" In an attempt to understand their motivations, Fang Zhou suggested that their irrational actions were likely a result of some deep emotional pain they were experiencing. He then questioned Don Quixote on his own reasons for going crazy, speculating that perhaps a lady had looked down on him, or he had discovered some improper conduct by his beloved Dulcinea. Don Quixote couldn't spot anything suspicious. He hadn't even laid eyes on Dulcinea, and she didn't know him from Adam. But Don Quixote thought that was the beauty of it all. Madness strikes for no reason. He wanted to show his lady that even fantasies could be this intense, making reality seem even more incredible. Of course, Don Quixote had a legitimate reason too. Why go mad? Because he has not seen his beloved for a long time, hasn't even seen her once. So he missed her so much that he went crazy, and now it was time for him to go mad, and he will keep at it. He will write a heartfelt letter to Dulcinea, and demand Sancho will ride his skinny horse and deliver it. He also asked Sancho to bring back a letter in reply too, and that'll be the cure for his madness. Believe it or not, Don Quixote's reasoning was sound. he said to Sancho, "If Dulcinea's reply does right by my undying loyalty, my madness will fade, along with the penance and suffering. If not, I'll truly go mad, and a man of true madness won't feel any pain. So no matter what the reply is, the pain endured by Sir Don Quixote will be lifted." See, that's pretty logical. So Don Quixote chose a spot in these high mountains as his base for penance and self-redemption. There was a stream running through it, and when he saw it he went bonkers and exclaimed, "God, I've found the spot to wail about my woes. My tears will flood this stream, my sighs will blow the forest leaves restlessly. Oh, my poor heart, separated from my eternal love for so long, is tormented and suspicious. And you, Sancho my squire, every move I make here is for my lady. Remember that, and tell her." Sancho saw all this and replied to his master, "I've seen it all. What else is there to see?" Don Quixote said, "Seeing isn't everything. Now watch me strip off my clothes, toss my armor around, and bang my head against a rock." Sancho said, "Heavens, for God's sake, watch out when you're banging your head against a rock. Who knows, that rock might have a sharp edge, and one hit could be the end of you. Anyway, this whole act of yours is fake. If you must bang something, hit the water or some cotton." Seeing all this, I think Sancho is getting mean. Anyway, Don Quixote restrained himself a bit and listened to advice. He wrote a letter to his lady, and then really stripped himself, did a headstand to show Sancho he was going mad, and sent Sancho off with the letter. Halfway there, Sancho met two of Don Quixote's friends, the book burners, the priest and the barber. Sancho explained the situation, and the priest said, "What should we do? We've got to help this madman." He gave Sancho an idea. And what happened next? Sancho ran back to the mountain and found Don Quixote, who was going mad. He lied, saying the letter was delivered, and Miss Dulcinea ordered Don Quixote to return to the village to see her. "She's waiting for you there." Don Quixote was thrilled, but he said he'd made up his mind to accomplish something first, worthy of her affection, before he could go back to see her. At this moment, a maiden suddenly appeared, part of the priest's scheme. She was dressed in luxurious attire, pretending to be a fabricated princess. The barber friend wore a fake beard made from a cow's tail, acting as her attendant. Together they approached Don Quixote. The princess said, "A giant has usurped my kingdom. I beg the great knight Don Quixote to uphold justice, to duel the giant and reclaim my realm." This perfectly aligned with Don Quixote's desires. He had always hoped for such a legend to manifest in his own life. Without hesitation he agreed. He followed the maiden back to an inn, where everyone was prepared to play their parts in this grand spectacle. Don Quixote fulfilled the dream of knighthood, and the maiden found her beloved, no longer willing to play the role of a princess. Next, while Don Quixote slept, they bound him and placed him in a cage on an ox cart, all faces hidden. When Don Quixote woke, he couldn't recognize anyone around him. True to his consistent logic, this must surely be another enchantment by magicians. I am under a spell, unable to resist. The mischievous barber friend then, in a chilling voice, made a prophecy. "Knight with the mournful face, endure your captivity without protest, for your great deeds must be fulfilled in due time. Furthermore, you will accept the bonds of marriage, and sire a ferocious brood of lion cubs, who will inherit their brave father's spirit. As for your squire here, you're the finest among all squires, with a sword at your waist, a beard on your face, and a nose that can sniff out trouble. If it's in God's plan, all your master's promises to you will come true without fail. You'll rise to high office so noble that even you won't recognize yourself. Your wages will surely be paid, and all that jazz." About half of this nonsense actually came true. Later on, in the second part of Don Quixote, Sancho indeed became a high-ranking official. But in the first part's conclusion, Don Quixote, still in the cage of the ox cart, was led back home by his friends, just like an animal in a circus. You might ask, what happens next? This leads into the beginning of the second part, where Cervantes writes that a scholar named Samson Carrasco arrives, informing Don Quixote and Sancho that their adventures have been written into a book titled The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, which has become a bestseller. Don Quixote joyfully asks, "In this biography, which of my deeds stands out the most?" Samson replies, "Opinions vary. Some say it's the great windmill battle, others say it's the liberation of the prisoners." Sancho is also pleased and asks, "How am I portrayed in the book?" Samson tells them, "You are the second most important character in the book. Some adore your wit more than the smartest men, while others say you're too stubborn. Your master promises you will become governor of an island, and you believed it." Sancho then says, "I bet those critics are like dogs that treat baskets and cabbages the same." This is a Spanish proverb meaning those who criticize him lack discernment. Then Don Quixote said, "Now I see, the person writing my biography isn't a scholar, but probably just some clueless storyteller." He went on to add, "But that's no surprise. Many theologians can't preach well themselves, but are quick to criticize others' sermons." That's Cervantes poking fun at how others judge him. Let's get back to the story. Restless as ever, Don Quixote sets off on his third adventure. As for Sancho, despite the hardships last time, he did bag himself 100 gold coins. So this time around, he thought about it and decided to stick with his master and brave another adventure. Their first stop was Toboso. Don Quixote was off to visit his beloved, saying, "Let's go to Toboso, where I can receive the blessings and admiration of the incomparable beauty Dulcinea. The favor of one's beloved can ignite the courage of a knight-errant like nothing else." Sancho, always ready with a witty retort, replied, "I believe that too, but where exactly are you planning to talk to her or meet her? Last time I delivered a message, I only saw her from over the backyard's low wall." Don Quixote retorted, "Sancho, why do you keep insisting you saw this incomparable beauty over the backyard's low wall? That can't be right. It must have been through grand palace corridors, galleries, porches, or something similar. Anyway, as long as I can see my beloved Dulcinea, her radiance will illuminate my heart and spirit, making me peerless in wit and bravery." Sancho quipped back, "Honestly, sir, when I saw Miss Dulcinea, she wasn't glowing or anything. She was just sifting barley, and the dust cloud covered her face like mist." It was quite comical. But Don Quixote paid no heed. He refused to listen. Refuse! Anything that hasn't happened in his mind isn't reality. He is convinced some jealous magician conjured this trick to deceive Sancho. In his mind, his beloved Dulcinea is a noble lady living in a palace, waiting for him. In reality, Sancho had no idea where Dulcinea lived. Last time, he never actually delivered the letter, but he couldn't admit that. So, he found a village and told Don Quixote to wait outside while he went to deliver the message. Where did he go to deliver the message? At this point, Sancho's cunning side began to show. He thought to himself, "Based on my master's behavior, he's someone who should be tied up like a madman. We're cut from the same cloth, as they say. Besides, people do not care where you were born. Instead, they only care about where you eat. If these sayings were true, then I'd be even more brainless than he is, since I follow him and serve him. Since he's a madman, if I run into a country girl, I'll just fool him into thinking she's Miss Dulcinea. He'd probably believe it easily. If he says Dulcinea isn't like that, he might still think it's a wizard messing with him, changing the way his sweetheart looks." You see, as Sancho gets to know Don Quixote better, he starts to tease his master. It just so happened that Sancho ran into 3 country women leaving Toboso. He hurried back to find Don Quixote and said, "Dulcinea is here with 2 maids to see you." Then he exaggerated their appearance, describing these 3 women as dressed in gold and silver. Don Quixote was now clear-headed and saw 3 country women approaching on donkeys, hardly looking noble. But Sancho insisted they were heavenly maidens on horseback. He rushed forward, grabbed a donkey, and knelt down shouting, "Oh, beautiful Queen, Princess, Duchess, Please grace us with your presence to meet your captive knight. He's a mess in front of your grace. His pulse has stopped and turned to marble. This is the knight Don Quixote, also known as the mournful knight. Seeing Sancho's earnestness, Don Quixote knelt beside him, uncertain and speechless. He even caught a whiff of garlic from the peasant girl. Interrupted by the two men, the girl got annoyed and cursed them for lunatics before whipping her donkey, causing it to jump and knock her down. Don Quixote rushed to her aid as she scrambled up, took a few steps back, then with a sprint and a vault, mounted her donkey like an agile eagle. The three women rode off on their donkeys, leaving Don Quixote bewildered, unsure of what just happened. Sancho quickly cursed the damn magicians, saying, "Damn these magicians! They turned Dulcinea's myriad charms into a monstrous visage." Don Quixote pondered and found it reasonable. Thus Sancho bluffed his way through, teasing his master in the process. Did you notice in part 2 of Don Quixote, Sancho's role noticeably increased? Cervantes penned many dialogues between Sancho and Don Quixote in this part. For instance, Don Quixote said, "Life's stage is like this. Some play emperors, others popes. Every role is there. After a lifetime, when death strips away the roles, we're all the same in our graves." Sancho replied, "That's a good metaphor. It's like chess pieces. Each has its use when playing the game. However, after the game, they all mix together in one pocket, just like people buried in graves." Don Quixote praised, "Sancho, your cleverness and wisdom grow day by day." Sancho replied, "Yes, because I'm learning from you. My dull mind is like barren land. Your words are the fertilizer. Serving you, conversing with you, is tilling that land. I hope to reap what I sow, a bountiful harvest." I couldn't help but chuckle as I read this, reflecting on how sometimes in life we can't resist the urge to preach or lecture others. Yet often it's laughable and off-putting. Maybe we should try Sancho's way. Let the bullets fly for a while to wait and see. For many times debates over right and wrong are futile. A joke or self-deprecation might turn over a new leaf, making everything easier. Of course, it's not a solution, but how many real unsolvable problems are there? Just like the issues Don Quixote values, the rules he adheres to, how many truly exist? Let's continue with the story. As mentioned earlier, Sancho indeed became governor of an island. How did this happen? In the second part, Cervantes tells a true tale. Fake sequels of Don Quixote appeared on the market. This also angered Don Quixote himself. He was originally planning to go to Saragossa for the annual tournament, but that fake book also included a story about him having such an adventure. To prove that this book was just a load of nonsense, Don Quixote decided to change his plans. Instead of going to Saragossa, he would go to Barcelona for the tournament. On this route, Don Quixote encountered a duke and his wife. Having read the first part of Don Quixote, they recognized him and knew of his eccentric antics. For their own amusement, the Duke and Duchess decided to play along with Don Quixote, treating him as a respected knight according to the conventions of knightly novels. They arranged numerous absurd games, including appointing Sancho as governor of an island. Of course, the island was not a real island, but a small town within the Duke's domain, albeit with 1,000 inhabitants. The town officials, under the Duke's orders, also played along with this charade. Their main goal, however, was to poke fun at Sancho. They announced that a new governor of the island had taken office, and according to tradition, he must immediately handle a case to demonstrate his outstanding intellect to the people. How did Don Quixote perform? His sharpness in judging cases contrasted starkly with his usual silly and naive demeanor. Let's recount a passage from the book. 2 old men appeared before the court, one of them leaning on a cane. The one without a cane accused the other of borrowing 10 gold coins and not returning them, claiming he had already repaid the debt. Now, in front of Sancho, if the accused swore that he had indeed repaid the money, the matter would be settled. The man with the cane agreed to swear an oath. He placed his hand on the cross of the cane and declared that he had indeed borrowed 10 gold coins from the plaintiff, and personally returned them. Sancho then asked the creditor, "Do you have anything else to say now?" The creditor replied that since the debtor had sworn an oath, he must have forgotten, so let's forget about it. The old man who had sworn then took his cane and left the courtroom. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? But no, our Sancho pondered for a moment and then ordered the old man to be brought back. Let's see what Sancho did next. When the old man returned, Sancho said to him, "Old man, give me that cane of yours. I have a use for it." The old man said, "Sure, your excellency, take it." So Sancho took the cane back and handed it to the plaintiff, saying, "May God bless you. Here's your money back." The plaintiff said, "Your excellency returned it? Is this cane worth 10 gold coins?" Sancho replied, "It is. If it's not, then I'm the biggest fool in the world." He then ordered the cane to be split open on the spot, and sure enough, inside the cane were 10 gold coins. Everyone was impressed, saying, "Sancho, how did you know the money was in that cane?" Sancho said, "Because when the defendant swore, he handed over his cane to the other party, claiming he had indeed repaid the money. After swearing, he took the cane back." So Sancho figured there must be 10 gold coins inside. Interesting, isn't it? Sancho is certainly sharper than he lets on. Besides that, Sancho is still Sancho, and everyone teased him, offering him delicious food and then taking it away. Because the governor's dedicated doctor said this was too cold or that was too hot, they wouldn't let him eat anything. Sancho, who loves food, was left hungry and miserable. While performing his duties as governor, judging cases, making laws, and inspecting, the poor man was exhausted and felt being a governor wasn't all it's cracked up to be. Just then, the Duke wrote him another letter, saying enemies were about to attack the island. He urged Sancho to rally the people and prepare for the battle like a brave governor. One night, while Sancho was sleeping, he suddenly heard a commotion, bells ringing, people shouting. He rushed out half-dressed and saw over 20 people in the street, holding torches and swords, loudly calling out to him, "Prepare for battle, your excellency. We don't know how many enemies have come to the island. If you don't show your skills bravely, we're done." With that, they dragged Sancho off to arm him. How did they arm him? They stripped Sancho down to just his shirt, gave him 2 oval-shaped shields, one in front and one behind, fastened to his shirt. There were ready-made gaps in the shields for Sancho to stick his arms out. Then they securely tied the 2 shields with ropes. Sancho looked like he was locked inside a turtle shell, standing stiffly there, unable to bend his legs or take a step. They handed him a long spear, which Sancho used as a cane to keep from falling. Then everyone had Sancho lead the troop, boosting their morale, saying, "Sancho, you're our North Star, our guiding light. With your excellency around, everything will turn bad luck into good." Poor Governor Sancho had no choice but to move forward. As soon as he lifted his leg, he fell with a thud, feeling like he'd shattered into pieces, sandwiched between the 2 shields, like a turtle or half-pickled pig in 2 wooden troughs. Of course, they were just playing a prank, stepping all over Sancho, slashing wildly with swords on his shields, and using his body as a lookout tower, standing on the top of it to command, shouting, "The enemy's fire is the strongest on this side. Everyone come this way. Guard that gap. Close that door. Block those streets with mattresses." Everyone seemed busy, while Sancho curled up praying to God, begging for the island to fall quickly and be done with it. After a while, someone suddenly shouted, "We've won! We've won! Your Excellency, get up and celebrate. Come and distribute the spoils of war." But Sancho had no mind for celebrating. He was tired and scared. The next morning, Sancho decided it was time to head back to his master, Don Quixote, with his beloved gray donkey. So Sancho served as governor for just 10 days. "I've had enough of this governor business," he said. "I wasn't cut out for it. I'm better off tilling the land, not making laws or defending borders. Give me a sickle over a governor's staff any day. As long as I can feed myself, whether it's turnips or partridges, it makes no difference to me." And so he returned to Don Quixote's side, and they resumed their journey. On the road they encountered a highwayman who led them to the seaside in Barcelona. There Don Quixote faced a fateful duel that would determine his destiny. How did it come to this? Throughout his life, Don Quixote had 3 proper duels, with a record of 2 losses and 1 victory. But the decisive moment came in Barcelona. Here Don Quixote encountered a true knight, and they engaged in a duel. It was early in the morning when Don Quixote strolled by the beach and suddenly saw a knight approaching him. Fully armored, his shield bore a shining moon emblem, and he called himself the Knight of the White Moon. He demanded that Don Quixote admit his lady-love Dulcinea was inferior in beauty to the knight's own lady, or face him in combat. Don Quixote could not agree to this demand, and willingly accepted their duel, even gaining the local governor's permission and endorsement. Luckily, this time, there were no major mishaps. The Knight of the White Moon charged with his lance held high to avoid fatally striking Don Quixote. The impact was fierce, and both Don Quixote and his skinny horse were no match for such a powerful charge. They were knocked off their feet and fell heavily to the ground. The Knight of the White Moon remained mounted and pointed his lance at Don Quixote, ordering him to return home immediately and stay quietly for a year. Don Quixote, always respecting the rules of chivalry, sadly accepted defeat and returned home with Sancho. And so, Don Quixote's whimsical adventures came to an end. Is it really that simple? Of course, there were many details involved, including the fact that the Knight of the White Moon was actually Samson in disguise, hoping to cure Don Quixote of his madness by sending him back home to recover. Some people actually preferred Don Quixote to remain mad. Cervantes created a character who said something very meaningful. "If you heal this incomprehensible madman, you harm everyone. Do you know that a clear-headed Don Quixote is of little use? It's the madcap Don Quixote who provides endless amusement. Once he's cured, we lose not only a comical knight but also a comical squire. This master and servant bring joy in dull times." In fact, this was Cervantes' motivation for writing Don Quixote. We practically laughed our way through this entire book because it's so full of entertaining tales. Everyone thought, as long as I'm not Don Quixote or Sancho, let the fun continue endlessly. So, there's a thought-provoking line in the book. Don Quixote is mad, but what about us? Which one of us is the real lunatic? A madman who can't make up his own mind, or a madman who volunteers to act as a crazy person? It's a question worth pondering. Let's talk about Don Quixote's ending. He lost the duel and felt disheartened. Sancho comforted him, saying, "My master, a heroic champion enjoys victory and feels elated, but he also remains composed in defeat. That's been my experience. Though I had fun as a governor, I'm not troubled returning to being a squire. I've heard that fate is like a tipsy old lady, capricious and blind. She stumbles through life, bumping into someone and helping others, but she is completely unaware of that." This is still Sancho's familiar style, sounding rough but making sense when you think about it. Just like that, no storms or sunshine, they decided to live like shepherds with their friends. Sancho knelt when he saw his homeland, saying, "I'll never forget my homeland. Look how your son Sancho's come back. Though he never made a fortune, he's taken a lot of lashes. Your son, Don Quixote, has returned too. So, welcome with open arms. Though he lost to others, he defeated himself. According to what he told me before, it is the most amazing victory in the world." This final statement by Sancho really resonates with philosophical undertones. So, with joy and happiness, Sancho went home to see his wife and children. Don Quixote, on the other hand, returned home and fell ill, bedridden for 6 days. He called for a doctor, who warned that his health was failing and his soul needed saving. Don Quixote remained calm upon hearing this. He slept soundly and upon waking, thanked the Almighty for granting him great grace. His mind also started to clear, realizing that many of the night novels he had read were utter nonsense. He declared that he was no longer Don Quixote, but the kind Alonso Quijano. Do you remember this name? This was his original name, the local nobleman. He instructed his steward to invite Sancho and their friends, and made his will, comprising three main points. Firstly, the money he had entrusted to Sancho before leaving was to be returned. The steward's wages would be paid in full, and the remainder of his estate was left to his niece. Secondly, his niece would only inherit if she married someone who had never read a night novel. Otherwise, the estate would be donated to charitable organizations. Lastly, the two gentlemen entrusted with executing his will were to apologize sincerely to the author of the second part of Don Quixote should they ever meet him. Even though he hadn't commissioned it, that ridiculously absurd book was still for him, and he felt guilty about it until the day he died. This will still retain a touch of Don Quixote's whimsical and humorous style. I wonder if Cervantes wrote this final scene with a bit of comedy to lighten the sorrow of parting. After making his will, Don Quixote fainted several times. There was chaos at the time, but his niece continued to eat as usual, the steward to drink, and Sancho to eat and drink and reunite at home. And so, Don Quixote, with his imaginative thoughts, ended his life. Meanwhile, the local gentleman peacefully closed his eyes. 400 years have passed, and both Don Quixote and Cervantes have left their names in their respective histories. After reading this book, perhaps we should reflect on whether each of us has a bit of Don Quixote and Sancho in us. I suddenly remembered a song that seems fitting for Don Quixote. It's a modern song by Su Huilun called Fool. There are two lines that go, "Don't call me a fool, I'm just pretending to be one, but I'm not afraid. Maybe I'm a fool, but I'm not afraid of jokes, since the power of fools is great." Yes, the power of fools is great. That's why Su Huilun named her first concert Fool's Invincible Landing on Earth. She removed all the packaging and was very real, directly and vividly singing Fool. It seems like it touched the hearts of all the listeners. This fool is constantly innovating, constantly challenging herself, and has never stopped walking on the road she wanted. As the song says, I was really a fool. Everyone wants to be considered smart, but sometimes being too clever isn't all it's cracked up to be. There are always those fools, like Don Quixote, who have no pretenses, only genuine sincerity in their actions. They don't scheme cunningly, they just live straightforwardly. Once they've decided on something, they go all in. When they love someone, it's without reservation. At work, they do their best. With friends, they open their hearts completely. Sometimes you realize that fool isn't lacking in intelligence, but simply lives life differently. It might seem funny, but they fear nothing at all. That's why the British critic Hazlitt believed that Don Quixote, this absurd story, reveals moving and profound emotions and ideas. It makes you laugh and cry. When we pity him, we're reflecting on our own disappointments. And even as we laugh at him, deep down, we understand that Don Quixote isn't any more laughable than we are. That's the story of Don Quixote. Besides being a laughable madman, he also had an adorable and respectable side. What do you think?